So about 4 years ago, on a chilly, gray spring weekend, I was looking for ideas for how to get my teenage kids out of the house and do something with me. And I saw an advertisement in the Observer first, and about a library workshop that would teach us how to make pinhole photography. This ad, in fact. And both kids liked photography. They both like art. They like making things. And so this seemed like something that they might do. And just as an aside, how cool is it that the library can teach you how to do pinhole photography and have exhibits and give talks on art. So such a cool place. So in this workshop, which my kids agreed to go to, I'm surprised to this day that they did. The workshop happened in the next room over, in the secret lab. And the staff, including Christopher here, gave us instructions on how to make the cameras. They gave us all the materials we needed, a cardboard box, some black paint, a paintbrush, a little square of metal foil, and a needle. And we followed the instructions. And it looks something like this, what came out. I've made some modifications since, but it's basically this. This is the simplest kind of camera that you can make. We were done with the cameras. We gave them to the staff, and they took them into the darkroom and loaded them up with a piece of photo paper, and then sent us outside. With one bit of guidance, they said, leave the pinhole exposed for 6 minutes. It seems like a very long time to take a picture, but we had no idea what we were doing, so we just followed the instructions. We went outside into the courtyard, a bunch of us, looking for something that would be worthy of our first pinhole camera shot. And also a way to keep the camera still for 6 minutes. It's just this very lightweight box, and keeping it steady that long, not holding it, was a challenge. And then we brought them inside, and the staff took them into the darkroom again and developed the pictures. And some of you might be thinking, what the heck is a pinhole camera? How do you get a picture out of a cardboard box? It's a very good question. I'm glad you asked. So the idea is very old. It was first written about by the Chinese philosopher Mozi, who described essentially what we call a pinhole, or a camera obscura, which is Latin for dark room. And it's something like this. So if you imagine that box there is a dark room, fully enclosed except for a little hole on one side. And what that hole does is let just enough light through to focus an image on the opposite wall. So whatever is outside will be projected and inverted into that room. And you can see it if you're standing in it. And because that hole is so small, it lets in just a little amount of light. If it was a bigger hole, it would let in all kinds of light. It would all be jumbled, and it would just look like you were in a bright room. But the hole being small, and also the fact that light travels in straight lines, gives you this image. So the top of the tree is reflected into that little hole and appears on the bottom of the box, and vice versa with the bottom of the tree. And that's basically how a pinhole camera works. Certainly people have been seeing things like this throughout history. You could imagine an ancient tribe sitting in a tent that might have a little hole in it. It would project the outside into the inside of the tent. But Mozi was the first to describe it and write about it. It actually happens in nature. So during an eclipse, if you're standing under a tree, if you look at the ground or a nearby wall, you will see projected thousands of little eclipses all over the place. And Aristotle in the 4th century was the first to attribute that to the little tiny holes between all the leaves on that tree, acting as essentially a camera obscura. Later on in the 10th century, Arabian physicist Al-Haytham was the first one to really describe the workings of a real pinhole camera. And the oldest known drawing of a camera obscura was from 1545. Again, all of these were ways to look at eclipses without blinding yourself. A little bit later in the 17th century, it was used, once they started to make them more portable, as ways to do drawing and drafting. So on the left is Johannes Kepler with a camera obscura above him, and he's sitting in this darkened tent and drawing on a piece of paper the projection that he sees through that camera obscura. And then there's this guy on the right with this wacky wearable camera obscura. I have no idea if this was built, but it's a fun idea. And the projection from that little pinhole is appearing on that paper, and he's just tracing the image of what he sees. But none of these were photography. They didn't have a way to, besides drawing them, permanently record what these images were that they were seeing. It wasn't until the early 1800s that Joseph Niepce from France, who was one of essentially the inventors of photography, he was the first one to capture a permanent image of a pinhole camera. And he did that by spreading some light-sensitive material on the back plane of that camera and then exposing it to light for, in his case, somewhere between 8 hours and 3 days. He didn't really keep records, but that was roughly what people have estimated. And where light hits the image is, or where light hits that back plate is where the image appears. This was the first, or the earliest known surviving permanent photograph from 1827. He called it View from the Window at Le Gras, but it's usually known today as Niepce's heliograph. He called this process heliography or sunwriting. And then about 10 years later in 1839, his one-time partner Charles de Gour and at the same time William Talbot independently discovered other methods for actually recording these permanently on paper and other substances. So this kicked off basically all of photography, and lots of experimentation happening, lots of different ways of capturing photography. And in around 1850 was coined the term pinhole camera. And pinholes enjoyed about 100 years of attention until lenses got cheap enough to make and people started to prize sharpness in an image or clarity. But even up until 2008, pinhole cameras have been used in scientific studies. This is a NASA pinhole camera. Sorry, it's a little blurry. But they use this to capture X-rays. There are lots of little pinholes on that front plate and specialized equipment in the back to capture the image, but still using pinhole photography. And so you saw the first picture, the earliest known pinhole photograph. This was my photograph that I took in the library. It's in the courtyard looking up to the sky. And if we compare it to the earliest, it's pretty obvious who the better photographer is here. But mine doesn't look like too much either. And if it hadn't turned out, I probably wouldn't be here talking to you. But that first success had a pull on me. I don't know why. I can't explain it. But when the kids and I got home with these 3 cameras, it seemed only obvious that we should keep trying to do this. But there were 2 barriers. One, I'd never developed anything photographic-wise before. There's YouTube, so I figured that one out. But we didn't have a darkroom. That was the bigger challenge. In my house, we looked around and tried to find anything that might serve as a darkroom and anything windowless. We found my son's closet, which at the time had a bunch of old clothes that didn't fit him and toys that he didn't use anymore. But it's about 3 feet wide and 10 feet long. It's enough to step into, but maybe could be a darkroom. But we didn't need it to be just windowless. It had to be light-proof. And a 1911 house, light-proofing was not on the top of their mind. Insulating wasn't really either. But we experimented. We played around with felt and tape. We threw a sleeping bag over the door and put blankets at the bottom, and eventually got it to be light-proof. And then if you add a safe light, you get a dark room. This is my son crouching on one side of the room and the developing tubs on the other side. Pretty tight fit, even for him at the time. But we figured it out. Just by coincidence, around the same time, there was somebody on the Nextdoor app that was giving away some simple photographic or developing equipment. So like the tubs and some tongs, even some photographic paper. But development, that part of it was still a mystery, how to make that happen. So I'll demystify it a little bit. There's essentially some paper or some substrate that you have, and on top of that you spread out some light-sensitive material. And back in 1727, the German polymath Johannes Schultz discovered by accident that silver halides are light-sensitive. And these are compounds of silver and any of the elements in the halogen group on the periodic table. I have one later if you want to see the periodic table. But he found that if you expose these to light, the compounds, these little crystals, break down, and you're left with just silver on the image. It doesn't happen right away, and the exposures that you have with photography are pretty quick. What happens right at the beginning is the light causes some breakdown, but just into these little seedlings of silver. So it's just kind of a start of the process, and to actually do the rest of it, you have to develop. So the picture is there. It's called a latent image. The picture's there, but you can't see it. You have to develop it to make all of the rest of the silver come out, and then you would see the image that you took. So just to illustrate that a bit, if you imagine the upper left is the picture you're trying to take. It's a bright lamp and everything else is dark. You take that picture and you get in the upper right a negative that is what you wouldn't be able to actually see, but you can see here the little seedlings of silver in the shape of a lamp, and then everything else is still these silver halide crystals that are undeveloped. When you develop, all of those little seedlings turn the rest of those crystals into pure silver, and they get deposited on the paper in a form that you can see. But there's still all those other silver halides in there that keep the paper light sensitive. So if you took it out into light, it would all turn black. So you use a fixer that washes off all the rest of the silver halides, and it leaves the image on the right as a negative. So that's development in a nutshell. But most developers are pretty nasty. You don't want to touch them. You don't want to breathe them, especially in this tiny little closet. I had no idea what I was doing, so it seemed a little premature to drill a hole in the side of my closet into the outside and install a ventilator. So I wanted to look for an alternative, and probably like what Joseph Niepce did, I went to Google and started looking around for something else that I could do. And what I found was this whole community of people doing alternative development methods. And one sort of had this, some traction, I guess, and some pedigree too. So a professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology and his students were looking for ways to use just household chemicals to develop pictures. And they came up with this solution that they call caffeinol, which is a mixture of coffee or tea and some other ingredients to balance out the pH level to actually make development happen. And there's really lots of variants on this. You can make developers out of beer or wine. People have made them out of cloves and rosemary. Anything that breaks down that silver halide crystal and leaves you with silver is a way to develop pictures. So now we had everything we needed. The first images that we took were pretty simple, just in our backyard, figuring this stuff out. And when that first picture showed up in the darkroom, I probably hollered a bit and felt maybe like what Joseph Niepce felt when he first developed his pictures. These are, I shoot onto negatives and then I scan them into my computer and invert them digitally. So that's all the pictures you see around here were started that way in this kind of hybrid process. And one reason I do this instead of developing onto positive paper is that, or fixing the image, is that there's no known fixer made up of just household chemicals right now. So I would still have to use some pretty nasty chemicals to fix the image, and scanning it is a quick way to get around that. So this kind of kicked off just a bunch of learning and experimentation and trying things out, different kinds of paper, different recipes, different exposures, and different ways to make cameras. So I've made a bunch of cameras since then. Cookie tins make really good cameras. If you know a pinhole photographer in your life, give that person a cookie tin full of cookies for their birthday and they'll really appreciate it. This was a box that had an adult beverage in it that my brother gave me for Christmas. One of the differences here is the narrower cameras with short focal length. They give you a wide angle effect, and with the very long camera here, it gives you a very narrow field of view, and it actually acts as a kind of zoom lens, a telephoto, so you get a zoomed in picture of whatever you're looking at. This is a camera that my kids made a few years ago for me for Christmas. Probably one of the most thoughtful gifts I've ever received. This is just a beautiful bellows style camera. So when it's compressed like this, it has a wide field of view, just like the narrow camera. And then if you pull it out, it has this narrow field of view. So it is basically a few cameras, and you can take pictures anywhere in that interval and get different effects. And then this is a beer can camera used for solography. So instead of just taking a picture for a few minutes, these are meant to be left outside. And really any of these cameras that are pretty durable, you can leave them outside for a long time. This is meant to be left out for a day or a week or a year with the pinhole exposed. And what you get is a tracing of the sun across the sky over the course of that time. This isn't my picture, just for full disclosure, but every line is one path of the sun across the sky captured on the paper. And as the seasons change, where the sun rises and sets changes, and so you get this whole band of light. And where there are gaps are where there were cloudy days. So it just wasn't bright enough to capture that sun at that time. So really cool effect. A little bit of patience is required. When I've done it, it's very hard to wait months to want to see what that picture looks like. You also have to secure it pretty well so that it's not affected by the elements and not affected by random curious people or squirrels walking by. So you just have to make sure it stays steady. A variant on that is, instead of exposing the pinhole forever through that 6 months or year, you go outside each day at the same time, the same solar time, and expose the pinhole for just a minute or two, and then close it up, and then come back the next day. And what you get is called an analemma, which is each dot is the day you took a picture, and this is how the sun travels relative to the Earth throughout the seasons. So just some neat ideas. But you can really make a camera out of anything as long as you can make it light proof. So there are cameras made out of trucks. Someone has made Lego brick cameras. You get very small pictures. You can make a camera out of a melon. There are companies that make cameras. Zero Image makes these beautiful cameras that you can buy pre-made. There are kits that you can buy to put them together. And so you can see there's this wonderful community of experimentation and making things and taking pictures and really encouraging everybody to have fun and learn a lot. There's even a World Pinhole Day on the last Sunday in April that all of us pinhole photographers try to take some pictures. But these are not your normal point and click cameras. There's no viewfinder. I can't see what I'm taking a picture of. There's no preview mode. There's no focus also. I don't get to manipulate that. In fact, one of the distinguishing characteristics of pinhole cameras is that they have an infinite depth of field. So when you take a picture, theoretically, everything in your picture is at the same level of focus. There's no automatic shutter, so you have to have a sense of how long to leave the pinhole exposed, and typically longer exposure times compared especially to lensed cameras. Lenses let you gather more light, and so your aperture can be bigger, and so your exposure time isn't as long. These apertures are anywhere from 0.3 to 0.7 millimeters, and the exposure times are somewhere between a few minutes and 20 minutes during daylight, just depending on the lighting conditions. If you're familiar with manual cameras, and we usually describe the aperture in terms of f-stop, somewhere between f1 and f22 is standard. These are between f250 and f350 as a comparison. For a long time, I was just trying to get images to show up, right? Learning the process, admiring them, passing them around, showing my friends what a weird hobby I had, and really amazed all along the way that you could get photographs from a cardboard box, a piece of paper, and some coffee. And I know the steps, I know the ingredients, I know a little bit of the chemistry and the physics, but it's still just magical to me that you can do this at all. And in the time since, I've gotten better at making images. Random, a little more controlled. I keep data on all the photographs I take, what the aperture was, what the exposure was, whether they turned out or not, and use that to try to calibrate the next picture I take. And I've gotten better at just kind of knowing what kinds of images are going to show up. Imagining, I think Ansel Adams told everybody to imagine what this picture is going to look like once you take it. I've gotten better at that. I've gotten better at knowing the limitations of the cameras, what not to take, what's not going to really show up. And I've modified those original cameras, as I mentioned earlier, made them a little more durable, made a rig for them to sit on a tripod so I didn't have to balance them under rocks to take a long-term exposure. And I'm still learning every day. So what to try next, what next cameras to make. And the originals that we made in the workshop, those first three are still my go-tos. They're reliable. I know them well. I know how they perform. I have all kinds of data on them. And so with that comfort, I've kind of taken them further and further. I'm starting to take pictures in my backyard, and then in my neighborhood, and then into town, into the countryside. If you look around, you probably can tell that I'm a sucker for a good old barn. And then I started to go on some dedicated photo trips. Wandered to Ohio and Kentucky. I packed them up into a suitcase and took them with me to California and Nevada. I've become a little obsessed with old ghost towns. But one challenge is I get one picture per camera. I don't have multiple shots that I can take with box cameras and paper. There are other pinhole cameras you can do that, but not with these. So to take a picture, a new picture, I have to swap out, take the photograph I just took out and put a new piece of paper in. And I have to do that in a darkroom. When I'm close to home, that's fine. I can just go into my darkroom and do that. But when I'm on the road, it's a little bit trickier. I have to improvise sometimes. I've made dark rooms out of hotel bathrooms, and sadly they're bigger than my dark room at home. But there's also tools that I use, like this darkroom bag. This is a darkroom that I can take with me. Basically, you put all the materials that you need into the bag, you zip it closed, and then through those armholes, you reach in and manipulate everything by feel, just blindly knowing what to do where. And so it's unwrapping the camera, taking the picture out, putting it into one envelope, getting a new piece of paper out, and putting it into the camera, blindly covering it up and taping it back up. And it takes about 5 minutes to do that, so it's pretty slow. And you also can't take like a dozen pictures of one thing and then later on say, oh, I like that one. Not that easy. So I've gotten a lot of questions about why do this. It's cumbersome, the cameras are fragile, it's slow, the pictures are not perfect pictures that you might want out of a camera. The development process you have to do by hand. Each batch takes a few hours. In the wintertime in my unheated dark room, I'm freezing. In the summertime, I'm sweating. And when I come out, I smell like vitamin C and instant coffee. And I have this perfectly good camera in my pocket, so why do this at all? And there are lots of reasons that I can think of. So first, I think back to that first workshop with the kids, and they're growing up too fast, and so there's a little nostalgia there. I think of my late grandfather who used to develop his own pictures, and I think of him whenever I'm in the dark room. There's also the learning piece of it. I love learning, so that's fun. And there's the do-it-yourself kind of aspect. I made these cameras. I touch every step of the process along the way. And there's also a deliberate slowness to this. So each shot matters. I have to take my time and figure out exactly where I want to be, because I'm not taking 12 shots and picking the best one later. There's also this kind of Zen acceptance of what happens while the pinhole is exposed for 5, 10, 20 minutes. A car can pass by in front. People wander in and out of the frame. A gust of wind can knock the camera or knock the subject that you're trying to take a picture of. And then the development process is slow, mixing and measuring and passing a piece of paper into this liquid that has a mind of its own. You never quite know what's going to come out, and so there's this process of discovery and surprise all along the way. And another reason is because they look like this. This is a pinhole photo, and the feel is so different than anything else that's done today. There's such a focus on hyper-resolution or dynamic color ranges. And I have a picture of this scene with my iPhone. It's a fine picture. It tells me I was there. It even has a date and timestamp on it, but it's not this. There's so many textures and stories that just pour out of these pictures. And I've been pretty lucky over the last few years. These cameras have spurred so many conversations with my kids about art and process, and they've taken me to different places around the country, some really, really stunning places. For the first year or so, I never printed anything out. I just kind of admired the pictures on my computer screen. But about 18 months ago, I wanted to see what they looked like blown up on paper. And when the first one arrived in a tube, I started to unroll it, and I fell in love with pinhole photography again. When it was on paper in my hand, there were even more textures and even more stories that came out of these pictures. And my first thought was, this might look good on my wall. And then I thought, maybe it would look good on other people's walls. And just completely on a whim, not knowing anything about the art world and never having done anything in the art world, not knowing what I was doing at all, I submitted this picture and a few others to a gallery and to the West Side Art Hop. And a few weeks later, within a few days of each other, I was accepted into both. And since then, I've been part of 5 art fairs and several exhibitions. And my art is on the walls of people from New York to California. And these have let me meet and talk to hundreds of people about pinhole photography and art and science. And I'm in this town. I've been living here for 30 years, and now I'm part of this wonderful art community where I've met all kinds of new friends and learned something from them every day. And in the summer, I'll be teaching my own workshops on pinhole photography. And this may sound like bragging, and I don't mean it at all like that. It's really astonishment. I had no idea when I stepped into that workshop with my kids just to get them out of the house for a weekend that the workshop would change the course of my life. But here we are, 20 feet from the secret lab where I first built those cameras with my kids. This is my first solo exhibition and my first art talk here at the library where it all started. And I want to thank you all for coming in to share it with me. I'm happy to take
If anyone
questions.
has any questions.
First, some shameless advertising, even more than just standing up here. My website, my Instagram, and dates for the workshops if you're interested. And thank you to Molly for helping me set all this stuff up, and for Christopher for being part of the staff that taught me how to make pinholes. Who has the first question? Christopher.
Okay, thank you. So, Glenn, I'm actually pretty ignorant about photography.
So am I.
I know a lot. I don't understand when you have a pinhole camera set up for a year,
Yep.
why you don't end up with a completely white picture.
It's just because the pinhole is so small. And what's interesting about those is you don't have to develop it. It actually, because it's out there for so long, the image gets burned right onto the paper. And all you have to do is scan it into your computer and you have your image. So that part I definitely don't understand all of the magic
Right.
there. But it's just the size of that pinhole.
It sounds like we need one for the roof of the library.
I would love to help you make one.
Glenn, you touched on this a little bit. So you take a picture with your iPhone.
Yep.
You take a picture with your pinhole camera. Do you have an example that comes to mind of something you saw in the pinhole camera that you didn't see in the 20 megapixel iPhone Deluxe?
I think it's, like I said, just the stories that they just seem like they have more stories when they're taken with a pinhole. And maybe it's the black and white part of it, or maybe it's the subjects I pick, or maybe I'm just used to iPhone pictures and these are so different. But I don't know, there's something that I feel when I look at pinhole pictures instead of an iPhone picture. It comes to life in a different way. Yes, Rob.
What's your holy grail destination that you want to go shoot? Anywhere in the world.
There are 600 ghost towns just in Nevada. And I think my next trip, though, might be New Orleans. That's one of my favorite cities in the world, and it seems like pinhole photography would do pretty well down there. Yeah.
Why ghost towns? What is that?
I don't remember why ghost towns, honestly. I think I might have seen some other people posting pictures of ghost towns just with regular cameras, and that hooked me a little bit, and then I just went down the rabbit hole. But I don't know, the subjects, the ghost hounds and the Pinhole camera just kind of seem to work together, even though it's weird, like weird timelines, like in time travel. Like the camera makes it look old, but it's already an old building, so it didn't look like that in 1800 when it looks like the picture was taken. I don't know, it just works for me. In the back.
Hi.
Hi.
Very unique and talented work.
Thank you.
Well displayed, so congratulations on the
Thanks.
exhibit. Looking at art is an independent experience for me, at least, and emotional too. And every time I return to it, I look at it from the lens of my own life. And I draw a different experience when I see it every time, whether it is this art or something else. And it depends on the intersection of my life I am at that point. Even though you touched a little bit when you said that the moment I had that painting, that picture on my hand, when I rolled it out. So my question is, does your opinion about your artwork changes the longer you look at it or when you come back to it after a long time?
I look at it in different ways at different times. So when, sometimes I'm ultra critical about it, and those are the pictures you don't see hanging on the wall. And other times, it brings me back to these places that I was, like in the desert in Nevada. It was such an experience just being there, and it's so different than Michigan. It could have been Mars for all that, how different it was. And so I get, all of those memories come back to me when I look at the pictures, and those are maybe some of the stories that I put into the pictures. But it's, different pictures do different things for me. Sometimes I'm looking at kind of the technical aspects of it, and sometimes the textures and the stories. It's just, it differs every time. Every time I look at it, it's probably different.
I have a logistical question for you. Do you bring multiple cameras with you?
I do. I have a pretty big backpack that I can put all 3 of the cameras that we built here in there, and then sometimes I try to pack some of the other ones too. These don't take the same rig as the other ones, so there's extra stuff to take, and all the paper, and if I'm going to be out for a while, I take the darkroom bag and sit in the back of my car and trade out paper.
One other logistical question. Do you, when you're taking your photographs, like from the beginning of your journey to now, what was it like to set up your tripod and try to get the shot and then go through the whole process of like developing your image, and then the angle's not like, what was that process like? Because you mentioned there's no viewfinder. Like
A lot of trial and error. I do use my iPhone to give me a little bit of a sense of what might be in the picture. The angle of the camera on the iPhone is sort of close to the field of view on those cameras. So it gives me a little bit of a sense, but it's still, I'm guessing when I take the pictures, and I've kind of learned over time what might be a good angle on a certain kind of thing. Urban photography is one area that I just need to learn a lot more about, and getting the right angles on buildings and all of those things. So it's guesswork. It's experience, luck.
Does the size of the paper matter? Like if you put in a larger piece of paper, does that give you more capacity to blow it up, or does that not matter?
Sometimes. So the 5x7s are as big as I shoot, and it partly has to do with the field of view too. So like this one, I'm going to get a pretty small picture out of this. I can blow them up pretty high in most cases. Sometimes when I develop, it gets kind of granular, so I can't necessarily blow them all up as big as I would like to. And that's just me not taking enough time in the dark room or bad luck or whatever. But working with liquid chemicals is weird, even if it's just coffee.